This is FRM Part 1, Book 3, Financial Markets and Products, and the chapter on exotic options. Now, the important thing to remember is that exotic options are very similar, and they have lots and lots of the same elements as our regular old call and put options did, but they have some unique aspects to them, and that's why the term exotic is thrown in front. Exotic meaning that maybe you're going to be laying on the beach worrying about the price of a put option. How about some learning objectives here? So we're going to do lots of defining and describing exotic derivatives and plain vanilla derivatives, talk about the development of them, zero cost product, that's one slide. Then we're going to talk about all these different types of exotic options. And then we'll end with a discussion on volatility and variance swaps. Let's start with the difference between exotic derivatives and plain vanilla derivatives. Remember, plain vanilla derivatives mean exactly what the name suggests. They're plain, they're vanilla, which means they're kind of dull and boring. I don't think they're dull and boring at all. Maybe you guys agree with me. But notice what the first block point says. Represents the most basic version of financial derivatives, including things like forward contracts and futures contracts and swap contracts. It's a fairly liquid market. I mean, lots of these markets have tremendous liquidity. They have pretty standard maturity dates and expiration dates, and lots of the terms of these contracts have evolved because of the influence of the organized exchanges. Now, the exotic derivatives, they change the traditional characteristics to create a more complex financial instrument. And the reason for the complexity is exactly the reason that these standardized derivative exchanges were created, well over 100 years ago. They were created to standardize things so that they could increase liquidity so lots and lots of people would be able to get in and out of these contracts quickly. Well, of course, that's great for the majority, maybe even the overwhelming majority of derivative users. However, there are some specific individuals and institutions and entities that like to create these complex financial instruments because they're tailored to meet their specific needs. Now, the cool thing about these exotics is that most of the features are negotiable. I mean, you can walk into a financial institution and say, hey, I would like a derivative security that does this and this and this and this. And I'm willing to pay for this and this, but not that and that. And so these men and women at financial institutions, they're pretty smart. So they'll come up with a contract for you, and it'll probably be some kind of an exotic derivative. You can create customized hedges, and you can hedge through regulation or taxes. One of the implications of all of these markets is that there's going to have a direct impact on future market prices. How about this concept of a zero cost product? So think about the easiest way to do this. You could buy a call option and you could write a put option. And if the price of the call is equal to the price of the put, that's a zero cost product. So you have a position in two derivatives, right? The call and the put. But since you bought one and since you wrote one, you have cash going out and cash coming in. And this is a zero cost product. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can effectively transform a standard option contract into a non-standard one. And so these are things that you could probably come up with yourself. Restricting the early exercise to only a few specified dates. So say something like, the regular old standard American option, you can exercise it at any time from the time you buy it all the way up until the expiration date. But let's just suppose that you decide that you want to sell an option in which it can only be exercised on Fridays or every other Thursday. You can impose a lockout period. You can say, look, I'll sell you a 6-month option, but you can't exercise it during the first 2 months or 3 months or 4 months. And then you can have multiple exercise or strike prices in different phases of the contract. And so you could have an option that says something like you have the right but not the obligation to buy at $30 during the first time period, and then the $35 in the second time period, and $40 in the final time period, or kind of anything that you want. Remember, the interesting thing about these is when you change the terms of these contracts and you allow other types of events to trigger the early exercise or the sale of an option, then it's probably going to impact the price. Let's go ahead and start with gap options. I mean, these are really, really interesting things. And so I want you to think about this. With the regular old call option, we would have the right but not the obligation to buy a share of stock, let's say at $100. And so when the stock price is 70 or 80 or 90, we're not going to exercise. But when it's 110 or 120, we're going to go ahead and exercise. So we have one reference point. But what if we have two reference points? What if we have a strike price and a trigger price? And so the source chapter uses the notation K1 and K2. What the trigger price does is it determines whether or not the option will have a non-zero payoff. But the strike price will determine the actual amount of the payoff. Now, for calls and puts, the payoff is going to be non-zero. It could be positive or it could be negative, both for calls and puts. And it depends on the relationship among the stock price at expiration and the strike price and the trigger price. Now, here's a good example of a payoff. Let's suppose that the trigger price, K2, is greater than the strike price. Well, there's a nice little series of payoffs there. The stock price at expiration minus K1 will be the payoff if that stock price at expiration is greater than K2 and then zero otherwise. And, that kind of looks fairly simple and straightforward, but what I wanted to do is give you guys an example so you can make sure you understand this. So that's what I've done here at the bottom. Let's suppose that we have a regular old call option. However, K1 is 100 and K2 is 105. All right, so this is what the deal is. We have the right but not the obligation to buy at 100. But the value of the option is only triggered when the stock price gets to be 105 or above. All right, so this is an example in which the trigger price, 105, exceeds the strike price, 100. All right, so let's skip all the way to expiration. So notice across the top I have possible stock prices, and I've done this for you guys before. There's nothing interesting about the 96, the 100, the 104, the 105, and the 112. I could have a bunch of prices. They could have been 80 and 110. But notice that we need to have some values in and around the difference between the 100 and the 105. All right, so let's figure out what happens to the value of the call. Remember, we're on expiration, so there is no such thing as time value. So if the stock price is 96, then the call price is going to be $0, right? We allow the option to expire. Why would we pay 100 when we can go to the New York Stock Exchange and pay 96? The same thing happens when the stock price is 100. We might think of this as an at-the-money option, and it works kind of that way here. So the value is now 100. But once we get up to 101 and 102 and 103, excuse me, with our regular old call option, we would start to exercise, right? We would be happy about that. But now that trigger price is not 105. So at stock prices of a 101 and 102 and 103 and 104, right, the payoff, the call value is still zero. So what you're betting on here is that the stock price gets to be 105 or above. All right, so if the stock price is, think about this, 104.99, it's still a value of zero for that call. But as soon as the stock price hits 105 at expiration, then the option triggers. The option gets kicked in and you get your $5 back. And then at 106 and 107, all the way up to 112 and way above that, you get you get the difference between the stock price and K1, which in this case is 100. And so this call option, when the trigger price exceeds the strike price, works almost like a regular old call option, except there's that gap, right? There's a little gap from payoff when the stock price is 100 all the way up until it's 105. And then after it's 105, it works just like a regular old call. All right. How about if we take the opposite condition when the strike price exceeds the trigger price? And there are similar payoffs up at the top in blue. Now, here's the really cool part about this one here. So notice across the top, I have possible stock prices at expiration. Some of them are the same as the previous table, but some are a little bit different. So once again, if the stock price at expiration is 96, this is no good, right? This is no good at all. But what happens as the stock price goes up and hits the trigger price of 100? Oh my goodness gracious. You're going to be forced, as the owner of the option, you're going to be forced to come up with $8. That's why I have a -8 there. So as the price at expiration goes up to 102 and 104 and 106, then you're forced to pay less and less money all the way up until it gets to 108. In which case you break even again. So look at that gap in there. You can lose 8 or you can lose 1, right, if it's 107. And then as the stock price goes up, then you win again, but only as it exceeds the 108. So it's important to remember that when the strike price exceeds the trigger price, there can be a negative payoff. Now, of course, the first question that you should ask is, why on earth would anyone want to do these kinds of things? And the answer is, well, the writer of this option is going to generate a little bit more back here in terms of a premium. How about forward start options? This is exactly what the name might suggest. So the forward start option kicks off at some point in the future. So you could buy a 6-month option today, a put option, but it only starts becoming exercisable, or so to speak, at some time in the future. So you pay today, so you got to pay today. So this is kind of like a deferred option. How about a compound option? You can buy the right but not the obligation to buy the right but not the obligation. So a call on a call on a put on a call, and a put on a put. These things are fairly common in the foreign exchange market. They're also fairly common in the fixed income market because this is a great way to manage interest rate risk. A lot of times businesses will buy a call on a put when they decide to buy some real estate property, or they decide to buy some building, and then they don't settle for 60 days or 45 days or whatever it is. So there's that interest rate risk in there. And so they can buy this, call on a put to protect themselves if interest rates move against them. I always think of these things as kind of double derivatives, right? A call option that's written on a call option. So that's two derivatives. I never really read or heard that term double derivative, but it is my term. Maybe that'll go on my headstone when I pass away. This is the one thing Jim contributed. How about a chooser option? This is really cool. How about if you buy an option today that gives you the right but not the obligation to either buy or sell the asset, right? So if the asset price goes way, way up, you can say, I choose this to be a put option. Or if the price goes way, way down, you can say, I choose this to be a call option. Binary options we spoke about in a previous chapter. And what this means is that you have two payoffs. You either have a payoff, like a fixed amount, that's a cash or nothing option. So you either get a fixed amount like $10 or you get $0. And so you're really betting on the underlying asset hitting some number. So it doesn't matter whether the intrinsic value is $1 or $300, you still get that fixed amount. Now you can choose an asset or nothing option in which the payoff then depends on the value of that underlying asset. Barrier options, these things are kind of interesting. So today, if we do a regular old call option, we have the right but not the obligation to buy an underlying asset for the next 3 months, right? And so it doesn't matter during that 3 months. We know the price of the underlying is going to go way up and way up and way down and all that kind of stuff. All we really care about is what that price is on the expiration date, right? We care about volatility and all that other stuff, but that's really the ultimate bet. But a barrier option says something like this: look, I'll sell you a 6-month option, but after 3 months, if the price hasn't hit this number or some barrier, then it expires worthless. And there are two kinds: knock out and knock in barrier options. A look back option, this is another cool thing. Suppose you do this over time. It's a call option, so the price goes up and down, and right there at the last instant, the value goes from, let's say $5 of being in the money to 1 penny of being in the money. Well, what you can do is you can look back and say, hey, do you remember when that price was way high? That's what I want it to be. Asian options, they take average prices over a period of time. Like you could say, hey, my payoff depends on the average price of the underlying asset on the last 4 Fridays. Exchange options, these are for currencies mostly. And so what you do is you just agree to exchange one currency for another at some predetermined exchange rate. Basket options, you can throw anything in there. You can throw a share of stock, a bond, currencies. You could probably throw alternative investments in there if you wanted to, like a piece of artwork or a piece of real estate or an oil well. And so these are really cool because you have all the stuff that has value. And so you're really betting on the performance of a well-diversified portfolio. Well-diversified meaning, it's not just well-diversified inside of the stock asset class, but spread throughout all asset classes. Volatility and variance swaps. Let's suppose we have 2 assets, and let me just pick 2 simple ones. Suppose we have corn and wheat, and we don't really care about the price. We know the prices are going to go up and down over the next several months. But what we want to do is we want to bet on not so much is how these 2 things move up and down, but how they move up and down against each other. So one of these things, what you can do is you can actually just swap the volatility. So if I'm doing corn and I think corn is going to go like this, right? And over here, wheat is going to go like this. This is what I think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to agree to pay the lower volatility and receive the higher volatility. Of course, if I'm right, then that means that I win, right? Now, the way you can work it, now that was a floating for floating swap, but you can also make it a fixed for floating. So you can just pick one commodity and say, okay, corn goes like this. That means it has a standard deviation of, let's say, 10%. So what you can agree to do is pay that 10% or receive that 10%, depending on whether you think the corn is going to go like this or like this over that next time period. Now, the interesting thing about doing the fixed for the floating is that if you agree to pay the fixed, right? You agree to pay the fixed. So you're paying out, let's say, 10% of some notional amount. And so if that volatility goes way, way down, if it goes way, way down, and if it goes all the way down to 0, it's possible that you don't receive anything. So you got to be careful with some of these fixed for floating swaps. That rears its ugly head for equity swaps when you could pay a fixed rate, and if the S&P 500 index is negative, then you have to pay on both sides of the swap. Now, of course, it's possible to use these exotic options to hedge. And remember from our option pricing days, and we'll do more of this in some future chapters, there's a variety of ways to hedge using options. And one of them is called a delta neutral position. And so what you've got to do is you've got to make sure that you have a position in the underlying asset and that you adjust the number of option contracts that you do regularly so that it can remain delta neutral. Now some of these contracts are just difficult to hedge. to hedge a barrier option here, this is one of the difficult ones. The portfolio that replicates its boundary conditions must be shorted. Oh, and then as soon as that price hits that boundary, then it has to be unwound, and then you might have to do it over and over again. And that takes us through our learning objectives for the exotic options chapter.